Japan, once regarded as America's most reliable ally in Asia and a pillar of Washington's strategy in the Pacific, is stepping into uncharted territory. For decades, Tokyo played the role of a compliant partner, carefully aligning with U.S. interests and avoiding any action that might strain the alliance. But that era is slipping away. Under the leadership of Chagaru Oshiba, Japan has taken a decisive turn, openly declaring that its national interests will no longer be subordinated to those of the United States. The message is unambiguous. Japan will act first to safeguard its own economy and its future, even if it means clashing with Washington. This dramatic shift is most visibly embodied in Japan's decision to resume importing oil from Russia, a move that flies directly in the face of US-led sanctions. It is not just an economic decision, but a geopolitical signal that Tokyo is willing to assert independence in ways that once seemed unthinkable. Yet the oil deal is only one piece of a much larger story, a broader recalibration of Japan's global stance at a time when old certainties are crumbling. Only weeks earlier, Tokyo issued a stark warning about its soaring national debt, a burden now threatening to spiral out of control. The expected response from Washington, support, reassurance, or at least symbolic solidarity, never came. Instead, silence. This silence cuts deep, especially considering Japan's unique role as the largest foreign holder of U.S. Treasury securities, with more than $1.1 trillion in American bonds. For decades, Japan's financial weight has propped up Washington's system, providing a lifeline that kept the U.S. debt machine humming. But under the pressure of Trump-era tariffs, ongoing trade friction, and now escalating domestic debt concerns, Tokyo is openly discussing the once unthinkable, selling portions of its vast U.S. bond holdings. Such a move would send shockwaves through global markets and signal, for the first time in decades, that Japan's loyalty to the dollar-centered system is no longer guaranteed. All of this is unfolding against a backdrop of rapid global realignment. The reliance on the US dollar, once near absolute, is weakening. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with more than 20 additional countries aligning with them, are laying the foundation of an alternative system. Brazil, long a cornerstone of the Western Hemisphere, is already considering issuing loans in Chinese yuan rather than dollars. Meanwhile, the United States is drowning in a national debt closing in on $37 trillion, just as appetite for U.S. bonds is drying up worldwide. Should BRICS nations and their partners fully transition to a yuan-based system, the very foundation of U.S. economic dominance could begin to crumble, quietly, perhaps slowly, but irreversibly. In this shifting world order, Japan's moves stand out not only for their economic significance, but for their symbolism. Tokyo's decision to resume Russian oil imports is a striking departure from decades of quiet compliance with Washington's directives. For the first time in a generation, Japan is not merely drifting slightly off course, it is charting an independent path. The specifics of the oil deal make the story even more revealing. The shipment in question, 600,000 barrels of Sokol blend crude, was purchased by Tao Oil, a Japanese private refiner, from the Sakhalin II project. This project, already vital to Japan's energy security, also provides liquefied natural gas, the cornerstone of Japan's post-Fukushima energy mix. Since oil is produced as a byproduct of that gas, rejecting the oil would risk disrupting gas supplies as well. In short, Japan faced a stark choice: defy sanctions or compromise its own energy security. Tokyo chose survival. Not only did the government approve the transaction, but it actively facilitated it, knowing full well that it ran counter to Washington's preferences. The deal moves forward under a temporary U.S. waiver, an exemption designed to give Japan breathing room. But the message is unmistakable. Tokyo will no longer wait for permission to sustain its economy. Adding to the drama, the oil was delivered by the Voyager, a tanker blacklisted under U.S. and European sanctions. Under normal circumstances, engaging such a vessel would be a high-risk gamble. Yet because of the waiver, Japan faces no immediate penalties. The EU, which does not enforce secondary sanctions on non-member states, cannot act. The result is a legally permissible but diplomatically jarring reality. One of America's closest allies is openly importing Russian oil on a sanctioned ship, and doing so with official approval. This incident underscores just how fragile Western unity truly is. For years, Washington rallied its allies around sanctions, painting them as a test of collective resolve against Moscow. Yet when Japan's energy security is at stake, unity dissolves. Tokyo's willingness to sidestep sanctions reveals a larger truth: that when national survival collides with political agendas, interests will prevail over ideology. The roots of this dilemma stretch back to the Fukushima nuclear disaster, which crippled Japan's reliance on nuclear power and left the country dependent on imported LNG. Oil, Being tied to that gas production is not optional but essential. Without it, the entire energy equation collapses. Japan is not merely bending the rules. It is exposing the limits of the West's strategy. If Japan can negotiate exemptions, why not others? Each exception erodes the credibility of sanctions and extends Moscow a financial lifeline precisely when Washington and its allies are attempting to isolate it. What began as a straightforward energy deal has spiraled into a geopolitical turning point. Japan's re-entry into Russian oil markets is not only about fuel, it is about power, independence, and survival in an era where the balance of global finance and politics is tilting. Tokyo's move signals the end of an era where Japan quietly supported American primacy without question. Now, driven by necessity and emboldened by shifting global tides, Japan is asserting itself in ways that will reshape alliances, markets, and perhaps the very architecture of global power. Officials in Tokyo have sounded the alarm. Japan's fiscal condition, once hidden behind decades of stability and quiet strength, is now under extraordinary strain. Government debt has ballooned to more than 260% of GDP, the highest debt ratio among developed nations in the world. The yen is weakening, inflation is accelerating, and the foundation of the economy trembles under pressures not seen in generations. In a rare and sobering admission, Japan's own prime minister confessed that the nation's financial health is 7 worse than Greece's during its darkest debt crisis. For many, this statement felt like an earthquake. If the world's third-largest economy is comparing itself to Greece, what comes next? The reaction from Washington was silence. No promises of financial aid, no public reassurances, no diplomatic gestures of solidarity. Nothing. And this silence is deafening given Japan's history. For decades, Tokyo has been one of the largest financial backers of the United States, holding over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities, money that has helped bankroll America's wars, stimulus programs, and government operations. Japan financed America's ambitions abroad. Yet in its hour of need, it is met with indifference. That indifference is forcing Japan to confront an uncomfortable question. Why should it continue propping up the US dollar when the US refuses to support Japan in return? The shift in mindset is becoming unmistakable. Japan, long seen as America's most reliable ally in Asia, is drifting away from Washington's shadow. And as Japan reconsiders its loyalty, the ripple effects are poised to reshape the entire global order. The system that has underpinned decades of stability, dollar dominance reinforced by Western alliances, is beginning to crack under pressure. The consequences may not just redefine the balance of power in Asia, but could reshape geopolitics for decades to come. In the United States, the financial strain is also mounting. With debt nearing an unfathomable $37 trillion, the government may soon be forced to sell off bonds on a massive scale just to stabilize its economy. If that happens, interest rates could skyrocket, sending borrowing costs higher across every sector of American life, from mortgages and student loans to government financing itself. The dollar could weaken sharply, losing value against rival currencies, while other nations, watching closely after Japan's actions, might decide to dump their U.S. debt holdings as well. A chain reaction could begin, and once it starts, stopping it may be impossible. Amid this uncertainty, Japan is signaling new strategies. Despite its long history of rivalry and disputes with China, Tokyo is opening the door to deeper economic cooperation with Beijing. At the same time, it is expanding ties with other Asian economies, quietly preparing for a future where it must rely less on the West and more on its own regional alliances and internal strength. Meanwhile, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are taking bold steps once whispered only in secret meetings, but now openly displayed on the world stage. They are turning away from U.S. treasuries and buying Chinese yuan-denominated bonds instead. The shift is not just symbolic, it is systemic. Brazil was the first to break precedent, issuing bonds in yuan instead of the traditional dollar. For global markets, this was a signal flare. The dollar's supremacy is no longer untouchable. This trend is not only financial but political, rooted in sovereignty and survival. After the U.S. froze Russia's reserves and cut Moscow off from international payment networks, many nations realized their own funds could be weaponized in future conflicts. The message was clear. In a dollar-centric system, no one is safe from American political leverage. That fear is now pushing countries to seek protection in alternatives. Brazil, for instance, has shifted eastward, embracing China's vast financial network. Chinese terms are attractive. Lower restrictions, flexible rates, favorable deals, and access to a rapidly growing yuan-based infrastructure. Other nations are watching and learning. India, South Africa, Turkey, Argentina, and a long list of others are preparing to follow. Across the global south, yuan-denominated bonds are being seen as safer, smarter, and freer from the risks of U.S. domination. China has carefully prepared for this moment. Over the past decade, it has built a parallel financial system, yuan settlement mechanisms, bilateral currency swap agreements, and streamlined channels for foreign investment. The goal was simple, to make the yuan a true global alternative. That preparation is now paying off. Chinese banks are actively supporting BRICS nations, not just in issuing yuan-based bonds but in creating full-scale financial operations around them. Brazil's announcement of panda bonds, bonds denominated in yuan, marks a historic milestone. Brazil is not a small economy. It is a major player in agriculture, energy, and trade. If Brazil successfully raises capital in yuan, others will almost certainly follow, triggering what could become the largest and most prolonged shift away from the US dollar in modern history. For the United States, the danger is profound. As fewer nations buy treasuries, Washington will need to raise interest rates further to lure investors. But each increase adds immense weight to America's already staggering debt load. Hundreds of billions more in annual interest payments could follow. The dollar may not collapse overnight, but its privileged status, the status that allowed the US to spend and borrow almost without limit, is quietly slipping away. If foreign capital dries up, America could face the once unthinkable, struggling to finance its own government. Japan's bond market tells a parallel story of upheaval. Long-term yields are surging. The 40-year bond yield hit a record 3.07%, the highest in years, before easing slightly but still far above where it began the year. Even 20- and 30-year bond yields have climbed by 50 to 60 basis points. In the world of government bonds, these are massive swings. The result? Japanese investors are pulling money home. In 2024 alone, they poured nearly 28 trillion yen, about $180 billion, into domestic government bonds, while slashing their holdings of US and foreign debt by half. This is not a trickle, it is a flood. Capital is leaving America and flowing back to Tokyo. Step back and the picture becomes clear. Confidence in the US financial system is eroding faster than Washington expected. From Tokyo to Sao Paulo, from Johannesburg to New Delhi, trust in the dollar is being questioned. The very foundation of America's global influence, the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, is showing cracks. And now the critical question looms. What will Donald Trump do next? Will he attempt to rebuild trust, shore up America's alliances, and stabilize the financial system? Or will he double down on confrontation, driving nations even faster toward alternatives? The world is watching. This moment may be remembered as the turning point, the collapse of the old financial order and the birth of a new one. A system where no single currency holds unchallenged dominance, where global power is shared among competing blocs, and where the future of finance is written not in Washington but in Beijing, Tokyo, and beyond. Stay alert, because the transformation is not coming someday in the distant future. It is unfolding right now before our eyes.